information for yourself as a parent. But we didn't get a lot of responses, so I'm not sure of who else in the audience. I've tried to kind of revamp my presentation so that it is something that will work for people from any kind of career and also for parents. So before I get started, I think it's really important to talk a little bit about the issue of shame in parenting. All of us who are parents have moments of parent shame, I refer to it as, and it's important that during this type of a presentation where we're going to be talking about some of the things that can go wrong in parenting, that we all keep in mind that we are all works in progress, and that we need to use a little radical acceptance in the reality that we are all flawed and we are not perfect parents, and we all bring a variety of experiences to the table when we become a parent. And we may have experienced trauma that we haven't had an opportunity to fully deal with. And that is likely to impact us and how much stress we have. Not to mention the situations that arise where we may be under financial stress, may lose a job, may have to switch careers, may have to move to a different state or to a smaller house with our 6 children. You know, so many different kinds of stresses that we might experience that may push us for a period of time into a more toxic stress level. So I think it's really important that we not only try to take a non-judgmental stance with our clients if we work in the profession, but also that we learn how to be as non-judgmental as possible with ourselves and accept that we are doing the best we can right now, and we can do better in the future because we'll learn and grow and change. So I just wanted to preface this presentation with that. And hopefully during the question and answer period, we'll have an opportunity to talk a little bit more about some of the specific areas or professions that you work in, and what kinds of questions you might have about the material I present. So I'm going to go ahead and get started with the PowerPoint. Wanted to review the objectives for our course, and wanted to make sure that you understand that I created this entire webinar as an in-person presentation back in January and February, before the pandemic was really announced. So I did not originally prepare this as a webinar. I'd love to meet all of you and to have a chance to talk more directly with you and respond to specific questions that you have. But this is the next best thing. So the objectives that I originally created were designed to present more to in-home workers working in the infant and early childhood field. And so I have kind of readjusted things, but still will be talking a little bit about how an in-home interventionist can assist a parent in better meeting their child's developmental needs, particularly in the social emotional development area. So what is social emotional development? If I were in person, I would ask you to tell me what you think about that and offer what your own views are of social emotional development. However, We're not in person, so I want you to think back over the past couple of days. What are some of the emotions you recall feeling? Do you recall feeling happy?
Today I'm actually feeling kind of frustrated, to be honest.
Okay. I'm hearing some other background. Alyssa, can you hear me?
Everyone should stay muted. We appreciate, Jessica, that you just unmuted yourself to share. But I think Joyce wanted to have people share through that chat, if you could do that in the future until we have a break.
Okay. All right. Can you hear me, Alyssa?
Yes, I hear you.
Okay. I just thought for a minute that I lost everybody. Okay. So I want you to think back over your experiences in the past couple of weeks and think about the kinds of emotions that you experienced, and consider also your feelings in terms of how they might have affected some of your social interactions or relationships with others. Our emotions affect who we are, and they influence our behaviors, actions, and interactions. All of the different times that we experience intense emotion affect not only us internally, but also others. Labeling and identifying and managing emotions are essential skills for us to engage in meaningful and successful participation in our life experiences. Difficulty managing emotions can not only cause frustration and disappointment in our lives, but it can strongly influence our relationships with family, friends, co-workers, and others in the communities. In essence, our social emotional skills can positively or negatively impact our overall quality of life, because in the end, life is all about connections and ultimately relationships. So as you think about what social emotional development means to you, what comes to mind? How do you explain social emotional development to the parents or caregivers you work with, or to the children you teach or do therapy with? The word develop originally meant to unfold, which can offer an understanding and a visual idea of what happens during a child's earliest years. Developmental changes are rapid during those first 3 to 5 years of life. New skills are constantly being developed for infants and toddlers. Change is the name of the game. So healthy social emotional development involves the ability to form satisfying, trusting relationships with others, play, communicate, learn, face challenges, and experience the full range of emotions are an important part of life, not just the joy, but also the sadness, the fear, the confusion. All things that some of us have been experiencing a lot more of lately in our current situation. It is through relationships that young children develop these skills and attributes. Starting from birth, babies are learning who they are by how they are treated. Those relationships are key. Social and emotional development is a child's ability to understand the feelings of others, control his or her own feelings and behaviors, get along with other children, and build relationships with adults. In order for children to develop the basic skills they need, such as cooperation, following directions, demonstrating self-control, and paying attention, they must have social emotional skills. So I've created this to demonstrate that social competence and emotional competence are very much intertwined. The social component is an array of behaviors that permits one to develop and engage in positive interactions with peers and siblings, parents, and other adults. While the emotional competence is the ability to effectively regulate emotions to accomplish one's goals. So when I was doing the literature review recently in preparation for this program, I reviewed a lot of different writings on social emotional development and some of the newer research on different aspects of that. I found many different lists of the key components of social emotional learning or development. In general, however, most of those lists were similar. Some listed out specific skills as part of the key components, but I've chosen to use the sources that summarize these 5 key social and emotional development component areas into this list that we will use for our discussion today. In describing each of these components, I will be discussing the mature skills that a person would ideally possess as an adult, because I think that when we're looking at child development, it's important to keep in mind what our ultimate goal is for that child, what the very best possible outcome can be for each individual child, but also what we see as professionals or as parents as what we want to see in a healthy, mature adult. I will also share some examples of what we see in infants and young children on their way to fully realizing the individual components. So our first in the list of 5 is self-awareness, which is that ability to accurately recognize one's emotions and thoughts and their influence on our own behavior. Along with that, it's involving the ability to accurately assess one's strengths and limitations while having a well-grounded sense of confidence and optimism. For example, I am aware enough to know that I am not a genius when it comes to PowerPoint presentations. And I spent a lot more time than my daughter, who's 34 and works in marketing, would have done in the process of preparing for this. That is some self-awareness I have about my limitations. I also have a strong feeling that I'm a competent therapist and that I have something to offer people when I do consultation around infant and early childhood situations. So I hopefully am able to fairly accurately assess those strengths and limitations. And what I find is that people who are under high levels of stress and may have struggled some with some developmental trauma oftentimes don't have a good ability to really identify their own emotions or the ability to accurately assess their strengths and limitations. Self-awareness is an important part of who we are as adults. And if we're an adult who is self-aware, we're going to have a number of questions that we're asking ourselves internally. Some of those questions will be, what are my thoughts and feelings in this moment? What's causing me to think this way? What's causing me to feel this way? And how can I express my thoughts and feelings to others respectfully? How can I share with that person that the way they said that hurt me? How can I do that without ruining this relationship or shaming the other person? All of those things are part of our self-awareness and our awareness of others. Of course, to get to this level of self-awareness and an ability to do the type of self-reflection that those questions would be part of, you have to get through a lot of other stages of development, including being able to develop an awareness that we are separate from our primary caregivers, that our caregivers have lives that do not involve us at times, that there are a wide variety of emotions or feelings that we can feel, that one can have more than one feeling simultaneously, that we can be triggered to have a feeling or emotion or a body response prior to engaging in rational thinking, that others may think or feel differently about things than we do, that they're a separate entity, and that a whole host of other pieces of development have to be put into place before we become fully self-aware. So when a toddler tells us that they are sad or scared or happy, or when they express autonomy and wanting to do things for themselves, we can see evidence of that self-awareness developing. Now, the next component is self-management, the ability to regulate one's emotions, thoughts, and behaviors effectively in different situations. This includes managing stress, controlling impulses, motivating oneself, and setting and working toward achieving personal and academic goals. And again, this is something that takes a long time to develop. And during our child's early years, we begin to see little pieces of that gradually emerge. But it's a long process. We're still seeing our teenagers develop some of those skills that go into self-management. And many times in adulthood, people still struggle with self-management. A mature adult with good self-management is going to be looking at what different responses they could have in a situation or event, and how could they respond to that event as constructively as possible. They think ahead to situations that may occur and begin to think about how they responded in a similar situation, what they need to do differently this time, how they can respond in a way that helps them manage or cope with the different feelings that may arise in a situation. When an infant reaches for a caregiver when they're upset, this is a sign that the child is seeking that caretaker to get assistance in calming. And that is the very first part of developing self-management skills. As we know, that infant needs their parent to help them organize and soothe, organize their emotion and soothe themselves to return to a calm state if they're upset. They don't have that internal ability at that point in their development to do that. And it is one of the most important skills that we will work to possess. When the toddler asks to play with a toy he wants rather than grabbing at it, he or she is also beginning to show the signs of self-management, that impulse control, a very big piece of life. Oftentimes, we see that impulse control is a struggle for young children on into their school age years. Social awareness is a broad category that includes several different pieces. The ability to take the perspective of and empathize with others from diverse backgrounds and cultures. Empathy, or at least true empathy, is not about, oh, gee, I felt like that. I've been in that situation. I know how you feel. It's about putting ourselves into somebody else's shoes and recognizing that they are responding in many cases differently than we might respond with our own background and within our own culture. It also includes the ability to understand social and ethical norms for behaviors. A mature adult knows what is socially acceptable and what is ethical, and ideally tries to work within those boundaries. It includes the ability to recognize family, school, and community resources and supports. And in each culture, those may be a little bit different. So when a family moves from another country to the United States, they may need some assistance from all of us in the community that they join to begin to learn about the resources within the school and community and what kind of supports are available. So a mature adult will ask themselves, how can I better understand this person's thoughts and feelings? What do I need to do to better understand where they're at this moment? And how can I better understand why people feel and think the way they do? Because there are bound to be times that others are thinking and feeling differently than we are. And the best way to be in relationship with another person is to be able to have some of that emotional understanding, the psychology of life, or the mind-mindedness. Anytime an infant looks concerned when another child is upset and crying, that's a sign that that child is developing some social awareness, and it's tugging at the beginnings of empathy. When the toddler reaches out to comfort another child or labels a character's emotions in a book or a video that you're watching together, that's also showing that social awareness. Now, the next component is in the category of relationship skills. The ability to establish and maintain healthy and rewarding relationships with diverse individuals and groups. This includes communicating clearly, listening actively, cooperating, resisting inappropriate social pressures, something that we really want to help our children do, negotiating conflict constructively, and seeking and offering help when needed. For infants and toddlers, when they show interest in being with others, whether this involves the cooing back and forth with a caregiver or exchanging smiles or giggles with other children, these are the early signs of the development of relationship skills. Someone with good relationship skills may ask themselves these kinds of questions and consider, how can I adjust my actions so that my intentions with different people and my interactions will turn out well? How can I communicate my expectations or my differing opinion or priority to other people respectfully? And how can I communicate with others to understand and manage their expectations of me? Yep. So um, when relationship skills are developing, we see infants show interest in being with others. And, whoops, messed up that. When infants show interest in being with others, they really are showing the beginnings of those relationship skills. They reach out for somebody. We see that they begin to recognize people that visit our homes and will want to go to them or reach out to them, such as grandparents, or maybe even the neighbor or a friend. And we want to encourage that. We want those infants and young children to begin to practice getting to know others. That is a really important piece of their development. The next section is on responsible decision making. And many would say that this is one of the toughest pieces to work with children and teens. That ability to make constructive and respectful choices about personal behavior and social interactions based on the ethical standards, safety concerns, social norms, and a realistic evaluation of consequences of various types of actions or decisions, as well as the well-being of self and others. Someone with responsible decision-making skills may consider what the consequences of their actions will be, not only for themselves, but also I'll be considering, how do my choices align with my values? And how can I solve this problem effectively? This is an important piece of being able to sit down with others and resolve conflicts and problems and work towards solutions together. When a toddler wants to climb and leaves the snack table and goes to the classroom climber rather than pulling herself up on the snack table, she's displayed some early responsible decision making. This is a great time to give her a labeled praise for that developing skill. And that's something that we really need to be doing all along the way with our children, is anytime we see them engaging in that behavior that's pro-social or that shows good social emotional development, we want to give them a labeled praise and recognize that with the child. And that is our best way of reinforcing that. So, what can a parent do to support healthy social and emotional development? As we look at that list, it all sounds pretty simple, right? The reality is, it isn't all that simple. Parenting is a demanding part of life. And as many would say, probably the most difficult job we will ever have, if you can consider it a job. I consider it a mission, as playing a role in nurturing an infant and developing a little person, as well as a teenager, is one of the most important things we'll ever do in our life. And we all screw it up. Yes, we will screw it up because we are imperfect and complicated beings, just as all the parents and children we work with. We all need a little, or some days a lot, of radical acceptance to accept who we are and accept the reality of how complex our world is and how complex each of us are. This is part of the reason that I tell my adult children we are all complex people who are screwed up in our own unique ways, as our parents and our parents' parents were. And sometimes I use just a little bit cruder language than that when I say that, as my children will attest. So welcome to the journey that is life, and know that as your mom, I will always help you pay for your psychotherapy. I've said that to him many times, because it is also a reality that sometimes we need more than friends and family for support and growth. We need someone who has some experience in accompanying others on that complicated journey through life. Someone who can help us see the messages on those signs that we aren't aware of along the road. Someone who can be with us through grief, loss, and pain, as well as someone who can rejoice with us as we begin to take new steps toward becoming our real self. Sometimes those steps toward becoming our real self aren't celebrated as much by the others around us, because it means we're changing in ways that others don't necessarily want us to. Someone who can be the guardian of our real self as we stumble toward a better, or hopefully better, understanding of who we are, independent of others, as well as in relationship with others. Okay, so I've zoomed through social emotional development. I wasn't sure how many of you had some grounding in social emotional development. There may be some of you out there that feel like I just skimmed the surface, which I really did, and were maybe hoping for something a little more in depth. But in a 2-hour program where we're going to be talking about both the social emotional development piece and the parental stress piece and how that all connects, I felt like I needed to allow a little bit more time for some questions and comments. So I want to open that up now. So Alyssa, you're going to help me with this?
Yep, I just typed, Joyce, that you are answering questions so they can type them in. Participants, I have kept your mics on mute, just because, you know, as you know, it's really hard to kind of keep track of who's wanting to ask questions when we don't see you until you come up to the screen. So we would just at this time ask you to type your questions if you have anything right now for Joyce. And again, if you need a prompt, toggle over your Zoom screen and you will see that you have a chat option. And then you can click on that little icon and then type away and ask a question. Joyce, Danielle asked if the PowerPoint slides are going to be available afterwards.
Yes, they will be available. So if you're a frantic note taker, keep that in mind. We'll make sure that that is available for you to print off, even if you'd like.
So I will be the conduit of getting those to you all participants. So you will get an email via the Eventbrite link. That's where I have all of your emails compiled. So I'll send out Joyce's PowerPoint link or attachment after the presentation along with a survey. Joyce, you have another question from a Bonnie. She asks, what sorts of things are red flags when doing home visitation support?
So I guess I want to know when you're talking about red flags, if you're referring more to red flags with a child's development or red flags related to parental stress.
She said parental stress red flags.
Okay, so we're going to be talking a little bit more about that in the second section. So I'll be sure and respond to that. But certainly, as we're observing interactions with a parent and child, we may see, even when a parent knows that we're present or observing, that they're not really very attuned to that child. And we're going to be talking more about attunement and how critical that is. That attunement, and then also being able to respond appropriately to the child by guessing, so to speak, what that child's emotion is or infant's emotion is in the situation. Another thing that I think is oftentimes a red flag is when a parent seems to believe that an infant or young child is purposely trying to make them miserable, is purposefully trying to frustrate them, or is being mean in some way to them. And having worked with some parents with some pretty serious mental health disorders, that's something I always look at, is how does that parent view their child? Do they really believe that their child's behavior has an intention other than to get care and connect? Do they think that that infant particularly is trying to hurt them in some way or make their life difficult? So if you see that, that can be a major red flag, and you would want to explore that more if you're working with parents. I've had parents even in the past say, I'm pretty sure that we mistakenly got the devil's spawn, and they're kind of joking about that. At least initially it appears they are, but then as they're talking about the child, they give so many negative intentions to that child. They really do believe that the child is in some way a bad seed and is creating havoc in their life on purpose. And oftentimes those children are picking up on that and responding as they grow to that belief on the parent's part. So that would be another big red flag.
Do you, Joyce, want to answer one more quick question? How are you on timing?
No, sure.
Okay. From Jessie, what are some things parents can do to help develop social emotional competence in themselves as adults? Are you going to answer that as you go through that portion?
Well, actually, I'll respond to it now in some degree. So if a parent knows that they have experienced a lot of developmental trauma in their life and may not have developed some of the skills that they really need to be successful adults and to have good, healthy relationships and to set limits with their children, to make good, well thought out decisions that consider the pros and the cons. Oftentimes, the best option, and not just because I'm a therapist, but the best option is for that individual to either enter therapy and kind of pinpoint things they want to work on, or to get involved in one of the parenting groups that provides a lot of support for parents as they're trying to navigate that system of helping their child develop social and emotional skills. I've had parents that have come to therapy for their own individual therapy and have identified that they need to come to therapy for themselves so they can help their child recover from a trauma. And oftentimes it's a trauma that they too have experienced at an earlier point in their life as a child. An example is a parent that may have experienced a lot of domestic violence, and then that parent finds themselves in a really controlling relationship where there's a lot of emotional abuse, and they begin to recognize that their relationship skills are compromised and that they are recreating a system very much like what they experienced as a child, and they want something different for their child. So they oftentimes come into therapy, and in the process, a lot of the work that we're doing is on those social emotional skills. Most of therapy involves work on social and emotional skills at some level, because as I mentioned, none of us get it all right.
You only had one more other question, Joyce, but I think that you responded. It was just a question that was about if parents are lacking in those areas, how can they help support their children in their social emotional development? But I think you covered that in that last remark, unless there's something else you wanted to clarify with this person's question.
Well, being aware of the social and emotional development of children, and really taking a look at the ages and stages type of material that breaks down what is within the normal range of development in the social emotional area. I think that is a really important piece as parents, to just come to the table with some of that general knowledge. And that's one of the things I love about the Parents as Teachers program and a lot of the other early start programs, is that a lot of that material gets provided in the process of supporting that parent emotionally. And it's a very effective way, I believe, for the parent to begin to feel as if they're more and more competent and up for the challenge of parenting, because they get both some knowledge and they get a person who is willing to just talk with them about the stresses of parenting and about all of the uncertainty that they experience. And sometimes about the sense of guilt that most of us have as parents at various times, that we're somehow not getting it all right. So sometimes having a parent come in through that Parents as Teachers program, it really can help the parent understand that nobody gets it all right, that the goal is to be a good enough parent and to try to build the social networks that can help support both us and our children.
Do you want to end questions and continue then?
You know, I'm going to have another question period at the end. So I'm going to go through some slides that will take less than a half an hour. And so then we'll have the remainder of the time for questions and answers and hopefully some comments too.
Okay, then go ahead.
All right. So this is the reason y'all tuned in, right? How does parental stress impact young child's social emotional development? Well, according to the professional organization focused on early childhood, that's called 0 to 3, within the context of one's family, community, and cultural background, social and emotional health is the child's developing capacity to form secure relationships, experience and regulate emotions, explore and learn. Children begin developing those social emotional skills as we talked about at birth. Infants begin turning their heads toward their caregivers' voices, looking toward their caregivers and cooing, and crying to let everyone around them know that they need something. Their emotional signals, such as smiling, crying, or demonstrating interest and attention, strongly influence the behaviors of others. Similarly, the emotional reaction of others around them affect children's social emotional behaviors. As children mature and develop their social emotional skills, they become less centered on having their own needs met by their caregivers and more centered on participating in routines and enjoying experiences with peers and caregivers. However, if the child is experiencing a parent with a great deal of stress, the child may become more focused on the parent's needs than on getting their own needs met. And this is an important part of how parental stress impacts their social and emotional development. Relationships are central to all infant and toddler development. Early interactions with family and caregivers have a lasting influence on development throughout life. Infants are not just affected by their own relationship with adults. They are affected by the relationships adults around them have with one another as well. And a very good example of that is the child that grows up in a home where they're witnessing a lot of domestic violence. That child is learning about relationships. That child is learning about how parents treat each other and ultimately whether or not they are valued. Because when the child is witnessing the domestic violence, they're feeling unsafe and they're terrified that something's going to happen to one of their parents. And in that process, their level of stress is so high that they don't have the attention and focus and the energy to devote to some of those other pieces of development that they would ideally have if they were in a home without violence. So infants and toddlers show how specific relationship behaviors to get caregivers when they feel stressed. They need caregivers to respond to them in a responsive and sensitive manner. And they learn how to trust others and regulate their emotions in the context of their relationships with their caregivers. Family practices affect social and emotional competence. For example, some families might place a high value on talking about emotions and expressing them as they occur, whereas other families may value doing just the opposite. We all know that each family is individual, and so that places a big responsibility on us as we work with families to really get to know them so that we understand some of those intricacies. So, nature versus nurture. There's been a lot of debate over this for many, many years, both in the mental health field and in child development and looking at children's behavior issues. Excuse me. There is some increasing evidence that nurture in the form of our family environment has a greater influence than may ever have been imagined, even as a child develops in the womb. So I'm going to do a little talk on genetics here, just one slide though. So scientists have discovered a kind of on-off switch that's on our genes called an epigenome. Some genes that we inherit from our parents can be switched on or off by stress, both in utero and in early childhood. In fact, throughout our life, those components can be switched on or off due to stress. This begins to help us understand why some children with a genetic predisposition to a disease develop symptoms while others don't. And it really helps us understand that there are a lot of things that we can't see that are actually impacting our child's behavior as well as our child's health. There are so many types of parental stress, and most or all of us who are parents have experienced some form of toxic stress at some point in our lives. While normal levels of stress are a reality of life, for some people, the stress level is as high as it was for our ancestors who were fighting for survival in the woods or jungles from all types of enemies. Our enemies, or what we are battling, may be different, but the stress can be extremely high at times, high enough to qualify as toxic stress, or stress that overwhelms our system's ability to manage it. And if we have to deal with that level of stress ongoing, our neural pathways get rewired, and we can stay in an activated state without returning to a fully relaxed state for days, for months, or even years. Unfortunately, we aren't alone in this. We have our children with us, whether they are in our womb, where our stress hormones can cross the placenta and impact our fetus's brain chemistry and brain development, or with us as infants, young children, school agers, or teens. And we are wired together in many ways. Science has made a lot of great strides in understanding how stress impacts child development, not only in the child's early years, but even while the child is still in the womb. And as one researcher, physician, wrote in one of the books that I read, it's amazing how during pregnancy, most women, at least in the US, are tested for gestational diabetes. Although gestational diabetes is much less common than toxic stress levels. And yet, many physicians aren't doing a lot of checking into the level of the stress that a woman is under during her pregnancy. Just like alcohol and nicotine, the stress hormones cross the placenta and they actually cause damage to the developing brain cells of the fetus. Now, fortunately, fetuses have a lot of brain cells, and as we grow and develop, we most of the time don't use all of our brain capacity. But those pieces of biology play a significant role in our emotional health and our development. When parents are stressed out, they're likely to be unpredictable or less attentive than they would normally be. And this can lead to less secure attachment with their infant and child. Or at best, it can impact one piece of that secure attachment. At worst, the child and parent may develop what we consider to be an insecure attachment. Anything less than a secure attachment can lead to a negative cascade, impacting many aspects of the child's development, especially their social emotional development. The core of social emotional development is that relationship with their caregiver. And at the core of that is their attachment. So understanding how stress impacts that attachment can help us also understand how it's going to impact the social emotional development of the child. Science has discovered how a parent's mind affects a child's body through a kind of emotional pipeline between the parent and child known as attunement. Attunement has always been understood as a connection that takes place because of body language. But in recent years, we've begun to understand that it's a lot more than the nonverbals. It's also a genetically wired kind of connection that makes that child so attuned to the parent that they feel the parent's stress. They intuit the parent's stress and absorb it as if by osmosis. So I'm not sure if if most of you have heard of mirror neurons. But if you haven't, they have some fascinating reading on it, as well as YouTube presentations. Daniel Siegel is one of the professionals in the field who does a really nice job of explaining mirror neurons. But mirror neurons, which are what allows our brain to mirror or reflect the emotions we sense another person, or a caretaker particularly, is feeling, are likely why the mother and infant are capable of this intense attunement. Mirror neurons allow us to intuit and to sense anybody around us that we are in close contact with, what they are experiencing as far as emotion. It's a capability that some people have developed more than others. And we see this with young children that live in highly chaotic homes. It appears that in some of those children, they are exceptionally attuned and exceptionally responsive to their parents' distress. So attunement and mirror neurons work well when a parent is emotionally available and can help the distressed child organize and regulate the child's emotions, because the mother has some capacity to mirror the child and to help gradually calm the child by her nonverbals, by her sounds, even by the smell of the mother can sometimes help soothe the baby. When less stressed parents can provide the sense, or when the parent is less stressed, they can provide the sense of security that the child needs to return to a calm space after being upset. And I would say that this is one of the most important skills that we can help our child develop. That ability to go from being really upset and having big emotions, as I talk with some of my preschoolers about, and being able to gradually calm and return to a state of level emotion. And that is something that babies don't have when they're born, that we help them develop. We help them begin to organize and calm their emotion. And it starts with us attuning to the baby's emotion, to trying to figure out, what is that baby feeling? Are they upset because they have a tummy ache, or are they hungry, or do they need a diaper change, or are they just overly tired? All of those things make a difference in how we respond to the baby. But ultimately, we want to help soothe them and calm them. So because of this attunement pipeline and the actions of those mirror neurons, stress is highly contagious between parents and child. Even if the parents are unaware of their anxiety or their depression, the child picks up on it. If the parent is experiencing chronic toxic stress levels, such as in an unhealthy relationship or domestic violence situation, even when that parent attempts to create as much of a calm presence as possible with that child when they're not in the middle of a conflict, the child picks up on it. The child senses danger. Just as within the animal kingdom, the child begins to anticipate danger and carry the contagious stress within emotionally. On a personal note, as parents of two children, a son who was 11 years old and a daughter who was in her senior year of college, our son became suddenly and severely ill with a rare autoimmune reaction that required a race to the intensive care unit at blank and a long process. The physicians later determined that for some reason, probably the epigenetics we just talked about, his immune system overreacted to a common mycoplasma infection, or at least that was their best guess. He spent a month in the ICU. He was placed on a ventilator while he was in an induced coma for 2 weeks. And it was incredibly stressful for his mind and body, as well as for all of us who were conscious and watching it all play out and fearful that he might not survive. He did survive, and we felt very blessed and thankful, but it changed us. It changed me as a mother. And maybe that's part of why I'm so interested in this topic. That experience rewired how I responded to any physical symptoms my son had after that. And he had to be hospitalized a couple of other times because of pneumonia. And they had a very difficult time figuring out what was causing some lung issues that he had. In fact, it took them about 7 years before they pinned it down. So we had a lot of stress in there. But I was a therapist, I always thought I was pretty good at taking what we refer to as a neutral stance, or remaining calm and trying to prevent my emotional reaction from spilling over onto other people. I learned that year, and in the following few years, that wasn't entirely true. The reality was that my son and I were definitely wired through that pipeline. Our attunement was in overdrive, in part because he had struggled so hard to survive physically, and for a while in there was so dependent on us as parents, more so than the average 11-year-old. But it is also true that pipeline was there all along. And that is something that I've really begun to understand even more. The reality is that none of us as parents can truly hide our emotional distress. And we need to be honest with ourselves and our children. We need to be honest that we are scared, sad, frustrated, or angry, and that we understand that they have big feelings too sometimes. We also need to be able to reassure them that we are bigger, stronger, wiser, and we will keep them as safe and secure as possible in every way we can. Because they need to have some way to calm themselves. They need to believe and be able to count on us as adults, at least the majority of the time. We can have a slight rupture in that relationship and not be attuned And we can repair that and apologize to our child, which is a really important part of parenting, to be able to own our mistakes, take responsibility for them, and to do the work to repair the relationship when we've made a mistake. If a parent is cycling through a chronic, toxic kind of stress-related depression, anxiety with a combination of anger in there, the child's brain can get confused and begin to rewire. And because of that, they'll always be a little hypervigilant and anticipate chaotic, high stress situations where they need to find a way to protect themselves emotionally or maybe even physically. It may become unclear to the child if their parent is safe or not, and if adults in general are safe. It may also be unclear to the child if their needs will be met. And they can feel a little frantic about that. And that's when we oftentimes see the child's behavior begin to change. We see either acting out, where the child acts out their fears and begins to develop behavior issues, or we may see them acting in or recognize that they are withdrawing some, or that they appear sad more, or they get quiet and pull away at times. These are all things that we need to keep in mind if we're under a high level of stress. And it's difficult as parents. When we are experiencing toxic stress, it's hard for us to be able to really focus on what that child is experiencing. The classic neuroscience truism is that neurons that fire together wire together. Our brains learn through repetition after repetition after repetition. And the rewiring of the brain of a child exposed to a parent's toxic stress level is due to repetitive experiences of the parent's difficulty in regulating their own emotions. So if you're feeling a little panicked because you're thinking, man, I've been under a lot of stress. I've lost my job, my husband's lost my job, or we're really struggling financially right now, or there's been a death in the family and I've just not been myself. I've been really overwhelmed. It's important to keep in mind that if we haven't lived in that high level of stress for long periods of time, and if we have others around us that can help us in parenting our child and comforting our child is less likely to experience that intense transmission of stress that I'm talking about with a parent that has a lot of accumulated trauma that hasn't been dealt with, that is also in an unhealthy relationship and experiencing a lot of stress, and maybe on top of that has had periods of homelessness or periods where they didn't know how they were going to be able to pay for rent. There's a difference when we're talking about toxic stress at a continuous level. Unfortunately, there are a lot of families right here in Iowa, where parents have toxic levels of stress that they've been living with for a while, and their children have been impacted by that. If a parent has experienced significant developmental trauma during their early childhood, they may carry a level of anxiety that's much higher than normal because of that rewiring that they experienced when they were young. And if they haven't had any therapy and haven't really been able to heal some of those painful yet powerful experiences from the past, it's not unusual that they will carry that with them and not even be aware of how high their anxiety is at times. Their normal is so much higher in many cases than the average person. And it has been that way for so long that they don't realize that they're going through life living in fear at some level. So I want to take us back to that social and emotional health definition. Within the context of one's family, community, and cultural background, social and emotional health is the child's developing capacity to form secure relationships, our attachment, experience and regulate our emotions, and explore and learn. Okay? The capacity to form secure relationships, the experience to regulate emotions, and explore and learn. Each one of these areas is impacted by parental stress. The capacity to form secure relationships. When a parent is extremely stressed, is not going to develop in the same way as if a parent's stress level is lower. That's just a reality. The child may be able to, if the parent works really hard, form what we would consider a secure attachment. But more than likely, there's going to be some holes in that attachment. There are going to be times that that security within that relationship is lower than is healthy for that child. We figure that about 70% of the population, at least based on research, has a secure or had a secure attachment with their primary caretaker. That means that at least 30% did not. At least 30% had what we would consider truly insecure attachments. And that 30% is almost always because of extreme parental stress, toxic stress of some type. And a lot of that is related to the parents' own developmental trauma that has followed them throughout their life and led them to struggle with social emotional skills, and then as a result to not be as present for their child. That experience of emotions and the ability to regulate emotions is also significantly compromised in many kids who have parents that are at that toxic stress level on an ongoing basis. Experiencing emotions and labeling them and being able to talk about emotions is something that we develop oftentimes from our interaction with our parents. From a parent that's able to talk about their emotions. And then to regulate them requires that early on we have somebody to help us regulate them so that we can begin to develop that skill to calm ourselves, to self-soothe, and to organize our emotions on our own. It's a long process of development from infancy through our toddler years and preschool years, and even on into grade school and teen years. Learning how to regulate emotions is a long, drawn-out process of development. And it can be impacted all along the way by not having a parent that's emotionally available and that can themselves regulate their emotions. Having the confidence to explore and learn requires that we feel a sense of security. And if we grow up in a home where security is always in question, it's going to damper our exploration. It's going to impact our learning. Ultimately, our best teacher for social emotional development is our parent. We watch them from the time we're born and on through our early childhood, school years, and teen years. And even as adults, we watch how our parents navigate those different transitions in life, how they survive difficult times. If our parents struggle with social and emotional skills themselves, we have a flawed model, and it's hard to develop those skills if who we are looking to for that guidance is struggling as well. I think that's part of the reason we have had to build in so much into our educational system around social emotional development. We really have had to try and supplement what children get at home because the level of stress within our society, the number of individuals who've experienced trauma is so high that we can't leave those children without some additional guidance. Still, as much as I hate to say it, the educational system is not the best place for a child to get that role modeling and that nurturance as they work on social emotional development. So at best, it helps supplement and will help in some ways. But the reality is we see lots of teenagers and young adults who really, really struggle. And we continue to see high percentages of our population struggling with drug abuse and all sorts of addictions. Addiction to food, addiction to gambling. All of those things are attempts to somehow manage emotions that they struggle to regulate on their own without the use of a substance or of some addictive substance. or behavior. If a parent's struggling emotionally, they desperately need encouragement and permission to get help so that they can be the best parent possible. They need somebody in their life who points out what they do well, just as we did when we were developing as children, to catch us doing it right, to give us the feedback that we're on the right path, to encourage that we stay working through the struggle. Therapy can be one of the best forms of self-care a parent can engage in. But unfortunately, in our society, therapy is often seen as a last resort. It's kind of the thing that people think of when they've struggled for the past 5 years to manage a situation or manage their emotional distress on their own. And they finally get to a point that they're so overwhelmed, they don't know where else to turn. So whatever we can do to encourage others, whether they're friends or family members or young parents that we're working with, to get some of that self-care in the form of therapy or becoming part of a parent support group possibly, the better off they will be. Okay, so it's all about our relationships and our connections. And it is critical that parents, particularly young parents, but also parents all along the way, have a social network, have social connections that they get nurtured through. If they're going to be able to nurture their children and provide emotionally for their children, they need to be getting that themselves. And much of what we need to do as professionals is be present for them, to be the encouragement, to encourage them to explore and develop some kind of self-soothing routines. Maybe before their children rise or after they are put in bed. Or as one young mom that I'm working with, what I've done is encouraged her when her children come back from visitation from their father's home and are oftentimes kind of in this activated, stressful state, that she practice doing some calming techniques with them, that they turn on a YouTube meditation video for kids, or that they do some child yoga together so that she can model that she is using this way to relax and to bring her state back to a calm one, so that the child can begin to use that and see that as fun. A very good way to give that attention to your child and to help, hopefully, to decrease the acting out behavior that may accompany that transition for a child. Encourage the parent to set healthy boundaries with their children as well as with others, so they can take some time for self-care. Oftentimes, if we get in that state of feeling guilty, of feeling shame that we're somehow not enough as a parent, we can not set some of those healthy boundaries and get into kind of a helicopter parent mode where we're doing everything with the child or for the child, and as a result have nothing much left as far as energy to devote to self-care. Encourage them to build and maintain those social connections with others sometimes family is not their best option, at least not the family they were born into. In some cases, the family needs to be recreated, and the parent needs to build some other relationships that will help nurture them. And encourage them to ask for help in that form of the therapy or parent support group. Encourage them to reach out for that. Okay, so it didn't quite allow 30 minutes, but I definitely want to allow time for questions and comments and talk through some situations if anybody has those that they want to talk about.
So at this time, Joyce will, if you want to type in any questions in the chat box, we'll answer those and I'll help moderate. We have one that came in during your slide, I think, about parental tips from Angela. So you want me to start with that one?
Sure.
Angela's asking you if you could address any parental barriers, maybe cultural barriers, or barriers about possibly like transportation, it sounds like, or their willingness to participate in therapy in particular.
Yeah, so there are a lot of barriers for particularly low-income parents, single moms that may not have good childcare resources, and I definitely recognize that. So it's not always an easy, here's a phone number, give somebody a call. I do see that with the clients I work with. One of the things that we have right now that I think is has become an advantage in some ways is that there is widespread telehealth available. So all of the clients that I see currently, I see via Zoom, kind of like we are doing right now, only much more interactive because it's one-on-one. And I was not sure I was going to be fully on board with that when I first did a telehealth session with a client. And that was back a couple of years ago, actually. And it was due to the individual's health circumstances and their transportation difficulties. But what I found is that it actually can be a very good connection. I've always relied so much on that in-person, shake somebody's hand, welcome them into my office as part of building a relationship in therapy. But I've been surprised at how well it does work for most people. So as long as the individual has access to a smartphone or a computer with Wi-Fi, they can do therapy without having to leave their home. Or as a couple of the clients that I work with do, they can do therapy from their driveway, sitting in their van or car while their older child is in the house kind of supervising things, so they can have a little bit of time alone. A mother of an infant can be breastfeeding their baby while on a telehealth session, talking about the stressors that she's experiencing, talking about what's going on for her. It is an advantage right now, and it's covered by Medicaid. It's also covered by all the insurances that I'm aware of. And there's an advantage for some people that have like Iowa Blue Cross Blue Shield and a couple of other types of insurance, they don't have to pay a copay. So that is an advantage when it comes to the transportation issue. The other issue of not having childcare available is a little bit more difficult. As a therapist, I do therapy with people as late as 9 p.m. So some of the single moms I've worked with will want an 8 o'clock or even a 9 o'clock p.m. appointment so they can have their kids in bed when they meet with me. So that is an advantage with telehealth as well. You're not having to drive to an office and drive home. You're not having to find daycare necessarily for your child. As long as you have those boundaries set with your child and you make sure that they have a regular bedtime. So I hope that answered the question. Was there another piece of it that I didn't touch on?
Any cultural specific barriers? So maybe if there is a culture that really doesn't believe in therapy, how can they approach that is what she's asking.
So, you know, sometimes there are specific religious groups and cultures where reaching out to a stranger or somebody that isn't part of that particular religious affiliation is frowned on. And I think one of the most powerful workarounds for that is to approach the parent from the perspective that this is something they do for themselves so that they can have the energy, the emotional energy to be able to provide for their child. And that this is a way that they can repair some of the trauma that they've experienced that will likely impact their child emotionally if it's not dealt with. So you have to have a relationship with the parent to get to the point that you can talk about how emotional distress, toxic stress, trauma will impact their child because of the child's close connection to them. So approaching it as this is a way that you can not only do something good for yourself, but a way that you can invest in your children.
Have another question that came in from a Charmaine. How can we support a parent who can't identify their own stressors and therefore feel that their child is just acting out?
Yeah, you know, oftentimes I see that in the process of doing therapy where a parent brings a child in and talks about the child as if they are this little self-contained organism that isn't impacted by anything in their environment, which we know is not true. But one of the ways that I approach that with parents is talking about their stress of dealing with the child's behavior and how they appear to be needing some help, or they could benefit, might be able to benefit from having somebody to talk to about their stress. Somebody that they can talk to confidentially and that won't be sharing the child's behavior with other people, because oftentimes parents are reluctant to talk to others that they know socially about how severe the child's behavior problems are. So that sometimes is the way I get that parent in to see another therapist, is by encouraging them to take some time to talk with somebody about their stress level as a result of the child's behaviors. But it is a tough situation because that lack of self-awareness is one of those deficits in the social emotional skill category. And not being able to step back and really evaluate what you are feeling on your own and how that is impacting others. That is one of the most important things to be able to do as a parent. I
Joyce,
don't have any magic, but that's a suggestion.
do you want me to allow them to speak freely and unmute themselves, or do you still want to just do the typing, especially for comments, if they just want to share comments too?
Yeah, definitely.
Okay, I have allowed participants to unmute themselves and ask Joyce questions if that's easier for you. And you want to be part of the recording, just so you know you're being recorded. That might deter them now, but you can
Nobody's going to unmute now that they know they're being recorded.
Well, I just wanted to let them know, right?
Yeah.
But you can still type your responses and I will relay them to Joyce too. I'll double check that I allowed them to unmute themselves to ask.
Just think of it as one of those late night call-in shows.
Ask Joyce, yeah.
Yeah. Oh.
Yep, it says that you're able to just click. So if you don't know how, participants, you hover over your picture and then you can see that there's an unmute mute. Right now there's like a little red icon that you're muted. And then you can click and there's a little blue text box that says unmute. And you can do that to, and then you'll be live, like Joyce and I will, everybody will be able to see your face or your profile picture, whatever it is. And then you can ask or comment if you want. Rhonda's asking a text question, so I'll read that one. The telehealth option seems to be very helpful for some. Do you anticipate this will continue to be an option after the COVID-19 situation improves?
We're in for a long haul here. I think there are going to be precautions in place for quite a while, even though Iowa is reopening some businesses. We still have rising numbers as far as hospitalizations and contracting the virus. So I anticipate for sure that we're going to have telehealth as an ongoing option through the summer. I'm relatively sure, at least. I would be very surprised if they removed that option. If those that fund Medicaid were to stop and think about the advantage of telehealth, I have several clients that got transportation paid for or provided through Medicaid to get to my office for their appointments. And so I'm pretty sure this is a much less expensive option for our insurance company as a state Medicaid program, at least. So I am hopeful that that's going to continue to be an option. And it actually has been an option through some insurance companies, but Medicaid had a barrier historically where the person that you do telehealth with has to be, or this used to be the rule, that the individual had to also be in either a medical office or medical setting, or they had to be in another satellite office of the agency providing the therapy. which seemed like a silly and unnecessary stipulation, but it was supposedly to guarantee a HIPAA-approved environment. So my experience has been that most of my clients are very careful to make sure that they have privacy when they do their therapy sessions. So I've not had to worry about them not being in a HIPAA compliant environment. So, other questions?
There's one from Blanca. She says that you referenced some books and professionals about when you're talking about brain development, and was wondering if you were going to share those resources, or if you have a resource slide on your PowerPoint, or can you add it when I maybe use that PowerPoint?
Oh, I could add it before I send it to you. I have lots of resources. And normally when I do an in-person event, I provide a PowerPoint and a separate bibliography.
Sure, yeah.
And then, you know, I can highlight during the presentation which references I think are helpful for parents, which for professionals, etc. But I would encourage anybody who's interested in learning more about the neurobiology behind development to check out some of the YouTube presentations. I've paid a lot of money to hear some of the people that have their presentations on YouTube when I've gone to an in-person presentation. Gabor Mate is one that I have heard in person several times that I really like. He is a Canadian psychoanalyst and physician who was born in Nazi-occupied Hungary, I believe, or the Czech Republic. And so he talks a lot about the neurological component of development and parental stress and how it impacts the development in general of a child. And particularly, he gets into talking a lot about how that parental stress impacts the child's body physically and can result in the development of allergies and ADHD and autism spectrum disorders. For example, it's all related somewhat to the epigenetics that I was referring to, where that switch is turned on, so to speak, regarding a genetic inherited predisposition. So I would encourage people to watch some of his YouTube videos. Daniel Siegel is another really well-known researcher and professional speaker in the area of neurobiology and neuropsychology and development. And he has quite a few videos on YouTube. Daniel Stern is another professional that has several of those same videos or types of videos, presentations available. And there's a really good book that I would recommend. It's on specifically on how children pick up on parent stress. And there's a lot of information in it on the impact on the fetus as far as the development and how that impacts long-term development. So I'll try and include all of those in that PowerPoint that I send you.
Yeah, because I think that's what Blanca was asking, is brain development in utero. So she will get that book reference. Wonderful.
Yeah.
Any other questions or comments for Joyce? We have, it looks like about 1 or 2 more minutes. And again, you can unmute yourself if you want to. Lots of thank yous coming in on the chat box and great presentations.
Yeah, thank you. I do really wish that I had everybody in a presentation room so that I could actually meet people afterwards. I would be willing to keep social distance too and wear my mask. It might have been harder to present with a mask on though, so.
And Joyce, did you want to say your email if they have questions that they want to ask you privately? And then I can type it in here too.
Yes, I would encourage them to email me at joyce.fullcircle, FULLCIRCLE @gmail.com.
Okay, I typed that in the chat box, everyone, if you want to write that down, if you have some questions you want to ask her later.
And please, in the subject box, reference the presentation so that I can sort through and make sure I get those and they don't go, you know, into my spam as Alyssa's email to me today did.
She almost couldn't join the Zoom.
Yeah, I was like, where's my link?
Okay, I also typed that in for you. So if you're going to be communicating with Joyce, write in the subject line the reference to this presentation. Well, we are right at 4 o'clock, so if there's nothing else, you could definitely email Joyce separately. And it didn't look like I missed any questions from anyone, I don't believe.
Sure.
So I just want to say one more thank you to Joyce for sharing your expertise with us and being willing to do this webinar for our online series, alternative to our Child Abuse Prevention Conference.
Given that it was my first webinar that I've ever done, I've used Zoom lots, but never a webinar. It is a different experience, but hopefully it went well enough that people could get some information.
Yeah, you did great. I'm getting one last quick question and comment. I will be sending out a post-survey link and the attachment to Joyce's PowerPoint. That'll come through the original Eventbrite registration, so it'll look like an Eventbrite email, just FYI. And then also, some of you are asking about certificates. And if the certificate generated by Eventbrite, which is just a ticket, is not enough for your CEOs or other things that you need, please email me separately. I will type in my email really quick and I can send those along to you for anything you need for credentials or things like that. I'm going to go ahead and end the meeting then. So thank you again, Joyce. And the recording also will be something I will send out to people who did not join us, or if that you want to see it again or keep it for your records.
Okay.
Thank you so much, everybody. Thanks, Joyce. Have a good afternoon, everyone. Happy Monday.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
You're welcome.